Okay, everybody, good evening. Hi, I'm Michael, and today I'm going to be presenting on a really interesting topic that I hope you guys enjoy. And this is going to be for young adult and adult learners. And we're going to be using our SURPASS series from Any Build and Grow to talk about some techniques that you can use in your online lessons. So let me go ahead and share my screen and let's get started. All right, so 1 second. All right, so the title of this presentation is Incorporating Self-Regulated Learning in Online Lessons with SURPASS. So what I want everybody to do from the very beginning of our presentation is just to look at this image that you see here in the opening slide. And I want you to remember this image because at the end of the presentation, I'm going to ask you to tell me what this image has to do with the themes and the topics that we've talked about today. Okay, so keep that in mind, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Now, the agenda for today's presentation, we're going to start talking about the future of learning according to the OECD. So the OECD, as I'm sure most of you know, is an organization for highly developed nations, and they've come together and they've gotten in touch with educators and people in the education industry, and they've come up with something called the Learning Compass or Learning Framework for 2030. So the idea behind this is that they want to address some of the big changes that are happening in the world and try to modify the way that teachers teach in the classroom in order to accommodate their students and help their students adjust and be successful in this future. So I'm going to introduce the OECD Learning Framework and explain a little bit about what that is. And then we're going to talk about how the framework isn't yet fully developed. So we're going to move from that to talk about self-regulated learning, which is a good supplement or a good way to think about the learning framework, but using more established techniques. So I'm going to talk about self-regulated learning, going to explain what it is, how it works, and then I'm going to talk about applying these techniques and strategies in your classroom, and especially in the online classroom now that we're doing our lessons online with our students. And I'm going to show you how this learning framework, this strategy, can be used really effectively in online lessons because it depends a lot on the students, and it gives students a lot of responsibility, and it's really good for them to develop their independence, right? And we're going to use some of the materials from our SURPASS series as we go through this presentation. And then finally, we're going to wrap up and address any questions that you have, and we'll have a Q&A afterwards. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So we're living in a changing world. And these days, students are facing enormous challenges, and they will continue to face some of these challenges over the next few decades. Now, these challenges are in a number of different categories, from environmental, economic, and social. So let me go ahead and let me ask one of our participants to give me an example of one environmental challenge that students will be facing in the next few decades. What is one big environmental challenge? So I'm going to call on a student, and I want you to give me your answer in the chat box, and then we'll read it out for the class. So let's see, we've got Jeanette Matos from Peru. So Jeanette, I'm going to ask you, what is one big environmental challenge that students will be facing in the next few decades? What do you think? So let's see what Jeanette says. Aha. Oh, so we've got another answer here from Jose. So I'll go ahead and read that out. Jose del Carmen Barrios says that sea level rise in coastal cities will be one of the big challenges that students will face. Excellent, right? So let's go ahead and look at what I've written here, which is, I think, related. So yeah, climate change and the depletion of natural resources require urgent action and adaptation, and sea level rise in coastal cities is something that they're going to have to deal with. In terms of economic challenges, scientific knowledge is creating new opportunities and solutions that can enrich our lives, but at the same time, it is fueling disruptive waves of change in all kinds of economic and industrial sectors. Finally, social changes. So as the global population continues to grow, migration, urbanization, and increasing social and cultural diversity are reshaping countries and communities. So again, our students are going to be facing all of these challenges over the next few decades, and it is our task as educators to try and do our best to prepare them to meet these challenges. Now, the question is, what does any of this have to do with ESL education? Right? I'm an English teacher, so how am I supposed to teach my students or prepare my students to meet these challenges? Well, the answer to that question is that teachers of all subjects will need to set broader education goals to meet future demands. So you may be an English teacher, but you are not just going to be focusing on teaching English, although that will be primary, but you will have to also think about other important aspects of learning to implement in your classroom. So one thing that will be important is learning to learn. So we're not only teaching subjects, but we're also teaching our students effective and efficient learning techniques that they can use and apply anywhere else, not only in the English classroom. So one of these techniques will be to form clear and purposeful goals. Another one will be working with others with different perspectives and capabilities, and being able to identify other people's capabilities and to use them to a great effect. Finally, finding untapped opportunities by bridging distinct disciplines. And we've got one more, which is identifying angles of attack and possible solutions to complex problems. So these are techniques that are not only taught in engineering or in scientific disciplines, but these are things that can be taught in any classroom with a strong foundation on learning skills. So educators will have to adapt their pedagogical strategies accordingly if we want to meet these future demands. Now, so to broaden these educational goals, you might be asking yourself, but wait, Michael, I'm an English teacher. Shouldn't I just focus on language instruction? In the English classroom, the most important thing, obviously, is making sure that our students are learning the language, becoming familiar, becoming skilled at using the language to communicate, right? Because language is an expressive and communicative medium. But the simple answer is no. You should not only focus on language instruction. So according to Linda Nilsson, a professional in pedagogy and learning, a major goal of education is to create lifelong learners. Only lifelong learners will be able to keep up with the explosive growth of knowledge and skills in their careers. Now, the question is, how do we produce independent lifelong learners? And how do we do that in the context of our English classroom? Okay, so I'm going to introduce this learning framework, which is called the OECD Learning Compass 2030. Now, if you just look at this picture, you'll see a couple of things. So starting here at the bottom, you'll see that there is a student, and the student is holding the learning compass. So from that picture, you can already infer, or you can get the idea that the learning compass is meant to be a kind of guide that will lead the student toward better decision making. Okay, so if you look right under the student, it says student agency. And agency is another word for independent decision making or autonomy. So looking at the learning compass, we've got a couple of competencies that we are really going to focus on. We've got skills, which are very important because to do anything well, you need to have the skill set. But you also have attitudes, knowledge, and values. And so with these core foundations, we move to the next round or the next level, which is the ability to create new values, reconcile existing tensions and dilemmas, take responsibility for your actions, and develop competencies that have the capacity or the possibility of being transformative. Okay, now the student has the learning compass in their hand and they're using this as a guide. And the question is, where is the learning compass taking them? Well, the answer to that question is, it is going to take them to a place where they will experience well-being. So if you look here to the right, you will see that it says well-being 2030. So based on these ideas and these strategies that the learning compass is trying to promote, the goal is to create students who will live successful, fulfilling lives in the year 2030, when the situation around the world in the economy, in the environment is very different and changing very rapidly. But at the same time, our students will be prepared for that. Right now, finally, before we move on, I want you to look very carefully at this, at these arrows that are going around the compass. So if you look at those arrows, there are three categories of action here. We've got anticipation, action, and reflection. I want you to keep those three categories in mind because they're going to we're going to come back to those in a minute, and they're going to be very important for what we're going to do afterwards. So anticipation, action, reflection. All right, now, the OECD Learning Compass. So what is it? It's an educational framework that offers a broad vision of the types of competencies students will need to thrive in 2030 and beyond. Okay, so what will they need to be successful? And it's intended to be a cognitive tool that students can use to orient themselves, which means to direct themselves as they exercise their sense of purpose and responsibility. So the idea was adopted to emphasize the need for students to learn to navigate by themselves through unfamiliar contexts and find their direction in a meaningful and responsible way, instead of simply receiving fixed instructions or directions from their teachers. Now, this is going to be the most important part of our talk today, right? Getting students to navigate by themselves through unfamiliar contexts, in this case, in using English, instead of simply receiving instructions from their teachers. Okay, so we want our students to constantly be learning and applying what they're learning in English, in the English classroom, without relying or depending too much on their teachers. So the central goal in the learning compass, or the central goal of the learning compass, is autonomy and agency in the student. So we do have a few problems with the OECD Learning Compass. The first one is that there is no clear pedagogical guideline which has been established. So if you're asking yourself, how can I implement these ideas in my classroom? The OECD Learning Compass itself does not offer those techniques. So it's just a framework, and for now, it's still very general because it's still very much under construction. So it's mostly a wish list. Now, the question that you're probably wondering about is, are there any existing tools we can apply to achieve learner autonomy in the way that the Learning Compass wants us to? So is there any pedagogy or any kind of theory out there that we can use to try and get our students to this autonomous or independent learning state? And the answer is, of course there is. So let's talk a little bit about self-regulated learning. First of all, what is self-regulated learning? So it's a cyclical process, wherein a student plans for a task, monitors their own performance, and then reflects on the outcome. Okay, so this is kind of the basic definition of self-regulated learning. And the idea here is that the student is in charge of the learning process, and the techniques that they will learn through self-regulated learning will be able to guide them in any subject that they are studying. So self-regulated learning, it has 3 stages, as you can see from the words in bold here. And these 3 stages are the planning stage, the monitoring stage, and the evaluation stage. So if you look at this chart, the first thing you see is that students have to plan how they are going to learn when they approach a lesson. So the first thing I'm going to do when I open my book, or when I am about to listen to some kind of listening exercise, is I'm going to think about how I'm going to approach learning about this. What are some techniques, or what are some strategies that I'm going to use in my learning to make sure that I do the best I can and I get the most out of this activity. Right now, from there, I'm going to start, I'm going to do my learning, and I'm going to monitor my performance. So as I'm studying the topic, as I'm reading about this topic, I'm going to ask myself questions to check and make sure that my learning strategy is effective and that I'm actually learning, I'm retaining the information. And so there are a couple of things we can do here to make sure that we are learning effectively. And finally, the last stage is evaluation. So after I'm done with the lesson, I'm going to think about how I did, and I'm going to evaluate myself. So did I do a good job? Were my learning strategies effective? And I'm going to use that information, the results from that performance, as a guide in my next lesson, in the next thing that I learn, to improve my learning strategies and become a better learner. All right, so going back to the learning compass for a second, if we look at these 3 categories on the outer edge going with the arrows, they look very familiar, right? If we look at anticipation, action, and reflection, those 3 categories look very similar to the ones that we just talked about in self-regulated learning. So why is that? The reason is that the people, the educators who came up with the learning compass were in fact using self-regulated learning as a kind of guideline. So their goal is self-regulated learning, but they're trying to make some modifications and they want to call it the learning compass because for them, this metaphor is a lot more useful and more effective possibly. So let's go ahead and let's get started with our lesson. And I'm going to show you how you can implement these strategies in the classroom to help your students become independent learners. Okay, so here we go. Let's take a look at a lesson from, this is from book 6 in our SURPASS series. So this is a C1 level lesson. Now, we're going to go through this and we're going to go through each of the 3 stages using the same lesson. And I'm going to give you a walkthrough so that you can see how you can use self-regulated learning with an actual material, with actual classroom materials. So let's go ahead and let's start with the planning stage. All right, now this is the title of the piece. The title is Innovate or Perish, How Singapore Became the City of the Future. So before we start reading, before we do anything, we're just looking at the title and we want to ask ourselves a couple of questions about this title. Now, when we're at the planning stage, it's important to make sure that we're asking 2 types of questions and that we are aware that there are different questions that we need to ask. So there are 2 types. There are content-based questions and there are also metacognitive, which means thinking about thinking. So thinking about how I'm learning. And these are questions that the students will have to ask themselves before they begin with their learning. So this is one thing that it's very important to do in the classroom, which is to teach students how to use these strategies explicitly. So if you want to use self-regulated learning, you have to explain to your students that you're going to be showing them some new techniques for learning, and you're going to have to actually explain how this works. You can do it implicitly if your students are at a lower level, but the higher the level and the more developed the students are, then you can actually go ahead and explain to them that you're going to help them become independent learners and walk them through this the way that I'm walking you through it now. So some questions that we're going to talk about, or that we're going to ask ourselves in the planning stage. So the first question is, what can I expect to learn from this lesson? So this is a content question. If the title is Innovate or Perish, How Singapore Became the City of the Future, what do you think you can expect to learn from this lesson? So anybody who wants to answer this question, please write your answer in the chat box and I'll take a look. So what can I expect to learn from this lesson? Any ideas? So as I'm waiting for an answer here, I'll just give you my answer. And so looking at the title, I would say that I'm probably going to learn something about Singapore and how it became the city of the future. And this is going to involve something related to innovation. So Singapore probably is an innovative place where they're doing lots of interesting new things, or creating new technologies. And if they don't do that, they will perish in one way or another. So just from the title, I can kind of get an idea of what we're going to be talking about. And this is preparing me mentally to understand the content of the reading passage better, right? So what can I expect to learn from this lesson? The next question is, what do I already know about the topic? So I'm going to think about Singapore. I'm going to recall some basic facts that I know about the city. So where is it located? When did it gain its independence, for example? What is the city most known for? What industries is it most known for? So we're going to go through this. And again, this is going to help establish a base from which I will learn new things, or from which my new the new material that I'm learning is going to be added. Now, this is the first metacognitive question that we have to ask ourselves. So what is my goal for this lesson, and how will I know that I have reached it? So in this case, when we talk about goal, we're not talking about the content, or like understanding the actual passage, but in terms of my English skills. So at the end of this lesson, I will be able to do blank. Okay, so that's my goal for the lesson. It's a learning goal, and it may involve understanding the passage, but there should also be some other components related to your actual English language skills. Now, what kind of questions should I ask to become more motivated or get the most out of the material? So this is going to be a very important skill for students and for teachers as well. Learning to ask the right types of questions, because the questions that you ask will guide the way that you search for information, and they will determine how good your understanding will be at the end of the learning process. So we should learn how to ask really good questions, and this is something that we can practice by reading passages and by checking to see if these questions can be answered with the information that we have in front of us. So the next question, what kinds of questions will I most likely be able to answer, right? If I'm looking at a passage, I should already kind of guess that there are certain questions that maybe I'll be able to answer by looking at this. But at the same time, some questions might not be, I might not be able to answer them here in this passage. I might need to go outside and look for additional information somewhere else. And this is okay because, again, this is adding to the knowledge that I already have, and it's creating a wider knowledge base for me as a learner, which is good, which is what we want. This is what learning is about, right? Widening your knowledge base. So finally, what additional information, if any, will I need to understand the material? Now, sometimes the material that we are learning requires background knowledge, right? For example, if we're learning about math or science, we might need some background knowledge before we can learn about an additional topic or something new. So this is important that the students are aware that, hey, maybe I can't understand this right now because I don't have the appropriate background knowledge. So what kind of background knowledge do I need to go look for so that I can understand this lesson? All right, now, all of these questions, you can write them out at the beginning of each lesson when you're in the planning stage and have students write their answers to these questions and then go over them together. And once students get into the habit of writing and answering these questions for themselves, then they can start using them each time they learn about something new. And this is the goal of self-regulated learning. So let's go ahead and let's look at some other titles of other passages. And let's try to think about what kinds of questions we want to ask ourselves in order to facilitate our learning process. So here I've got a passage titled "Competing Truths: A User's Guide." Now, if I'm going to be reading this passage, I'm going to think, okay, first of all, what can I expect to learn from this lesson? I'm probably going to learn something about this concept of competing truths. So let's think about what that might mean. Competing truths. Why truths with an S? Isn't truth singular? Isn't there only one truth? That's interesting. So this is telling me that there are multiple truths and that they compete. And next to that, I see a user's guide. So using, what am I going to be using here? If truths are in competition with each other, so this is probably going to be about different perspectives, something like news, and how news shows you different perspectives, which could both be true, but could omit certain information, and so could mislead you potentially into believing certain things. So here we've got another one, better together, and this is going to be a passage about something that is better when people work together as opposed to working individually, potentially, right? So anyway, the idea here is that we're going to ask ourselves these questions, and then we're going to think about what we already know, and we're going to prepare for the learning experience from a better, more stable position. Right, and here's another title. So let's move on. Now, we're at the planning stage. We're talking about Singapore, and this is a very simple way to ask your students what they already know. So you can create this really easily. You can actually, even using Zoom, you can go into the share screen and you can share a whiteboard and you can actually just draw this out, or you can prepare this. But the idea here is that we have Singapore and we're going to ask our students what they already know about this place. So let me go ahead and ask you guys, and just type it in the chat box. What are some things that you already know about Singapore? So just give me some facts about the country. And let me see what we've got here. Whoa, 1 second. Whoa, what's going on? All right, so let's see the chat box. It's a very organized society from Lucero Aguilar. Yes, very good. It's in Asia. Maria del Carmen Zuleta. Yes, it is in Asia. Very good. So we've got 2 answers, and those are actually very good answers, right? And so we're going to run through this, and we've got 5 here, and you would go through this with your students, and you would see how much they know. You would make sure that they have that the knowledge is actually correct, because sometimes students will tell you, oh, they have this or that, and you have to make sure and correct them and tell them, no, that's actually not true. But doing this together as a group will ensure that the students are all on the same page, right? So, okay, now we're done with our planning stage and we're ready to approach the actual lesson. So let's go ahead and let's move into the next stage. So now we're in the monitoring stage. Okay, we're ready to start actually reading the passage. So far, we haven't touched the passage at all. We've only looked at the title and we've talked a lot about our background knowledge. Now, in the monitoring stage, we're going to add new information to our existing knowledge base. If you look at the picture here, the red puzzle piece is the information in the passage which we are connecting or adding to what we already know. And then we're also going to self-monitor our learning process and strategies. So as I'm reading, as I'm learning, I'm going to, at the same time, check and make sure that I'm understanding and kind of monitor myself to see if what I'm doing is actually functioning. All right, so we're back to the passage. Now, what I want you guys to do is I just want you to read this first paragraph, and I'm going to give you 20 seconds, okay? This paragraph here. And after you read it, I want you to think about a couple of things, okay? So on the next slide, I've got questions that I want you to ask yourself. But before we go into those, I just want you to read this so that we have some material to work with, all right? 20 seconds, go. All right, is everybody ready? Hopefully you are. So now we're going to ask ourselves some monitoring questions, and let's see how well you understood and can remember what you've just read. All right, so first question, how does what I'm learning relate to what I already know? So what you read in that passage, those maybe 3 sentences, how does that relate to what we were talking about earlier about Singapore? So we know that it's an Asian country. We know that they are really good at technology, or they have lots of technology related industries. So how is that related to the passage that I just read? Then, which details in the material are the most important? Okay, what are the absolute must remember points? Now, I know that many of you right now probably forgot a lot of what you just read. You probably just skimmed it and you thought, yeah, okay, I understand this, it's not difficult. But now the problem is, what are the most important things that we have to remember from this passage? If I ask you, some of you might be able to remember, but I'm sure that some of you don't remember too much. So this is something that we as learners have to keep in mind, that when I'm reading a passage, I should repeat it to myself a number of times, so that if I put it aside, if I put it away, I can actually remember what I just read. So what material am I having trouble understanding? And this is something that you have to be honest with yourself about. Okay, if this is difficult for me, I'm having trouble understanding this, and then you have to ask yourself why. Maybe I don't have the background knowledge, I have to go find that. So this is something that an independent learner will have to become really good at, right? Knowing what their limitations are and trying to find ways to address those limitations and overcome those limitations. So, what material am I having trouble recalling or remembering? Sometimes we read a passage many times and it's hard to remember what we just read. So you have to stop yourself and think, okay, why am I having trouble remembering this? Why is this difficult for me? And then let's try and figure out a way to help ourselves remember it better. Now, the next question is, am I able to effectively summarize what I've learned so far? Now, the best way to test someone's knowledge is to ask them to summarize what it is that they know. So I'm sure that you've talked to somebody or you've had a conversation where the person is talking about something, but it doesn't really make sense. What they're saying doesn't connect, especially these days when we talk about news or we talk about topics that are kind of trending. When somebody tries to explain it to you, I'm sure that you've run into this person who doesn't really know what they're talking about. So the point I'm trying to make here is that you have to be able to effectively summarize what you know. And if you can't do that, it means you don't know it that well, and you have to practice and you have to work on that. So this is a skill that we should be developing in our students, right? The ability to summarize. Then how is my thinking on the topic changing, if at all? So I'm reading this, maybe my opinion is changing. Maybe I'm learning something that I didn't know, which is fundamentally challenging some of the opinions that I had before I started reading this. And if that's the case, why? Why is it changing my opinions? And again, recall. So memory. Memory is the most important part of learning because it's what allows us to keep what we've learned and to use it whenever the situation calls for it. So we've got a black screen here. Now, I want you to think of two things. The first one is, I want you to think for a minute about what we've learned about Singapore so far. So guys, go ahead and type in the chat box something that you've learned about Singapore so far from this lesson. So they're a small country in Southeast Asia, and they have lots of technology, says Lucero Aguilar. And the challenge now is land scarcity, water, and transportation. So this is very good. This is exactly what we want. So we want a kind of key sentence, which in this case is talking about Singapore and the fact that they have a lot of technology. And then the main idea of the passage, which is that they have some challenges that they're facing. And these challenges are land scarcity, water, and transportation. Okay, this is very good. So the next question. What have we learned about self-regulated learning? So go ahead and type in the chat box, what have you learned so far in this presentation about self-regulated learning? Let's go ahead and take a look at the chat box. So as you guys are typing in your answers, we're going to move on and we're going to look at the rest of the lesson so you have an idea of what a full passage looks like. Now, if you want to give your students kind of a shortcut for remembering the theme or the information in a passage, one good way of going about it is to look at the titles and headings. So in this case, I've circled all the subheadings in red and I've underlined the key sentence here. So let's go ahead and read these. Innovate or perish, how Singapore became the city of the future. So how did it become the city of the future? Well, it's small in size and lacks resources. And so it's betting on technology to help solve many of its problems. And these problems are separated into three here in this passage. And so they are land and housing, movement, transportation, and food and water. And if we read this passage and we remember these headings, then we will be able to remember a lot of the information in the passage. Because for example, if I've read this and I know what the land and housing policies in Singapore are, then just remembering the title will help me remember the details of this part of the passage, right? So this is the key thing. Remember, give yourself some memory shortcuts so that you can then trigger a cascade of memory in terms of all of the details, right? Okay, now we're moving into the evaluation stage. Okay, so we've finished the lesson and now we're going to see how well we did and how much we learned. And we're going to look at our learning strategies and we're going to see if we need to change anything. All right, so I'm a student and I've just read the passage and I'm satisfied with my learning. I think I did a good job. I remember a lot, and I talked about it in class. So I feel that the lesson was a success. Okay, now I'm going to think about what I did in that lesson and how I learned, and I'm going to see if I need to modify or change anything for the next time that I learn about something. So evaluating questions that I need to ask myself as a student. And yeah, in this case, in this stage, we're gonna check how well we performed. And so the first question is, what did I learn? And again, this is a content question, okay? So this is going to be basically summarizing what the passage was about. Now, how well did I master what I set out to learn? So at the beginning, I said that my learning goal was to improve my explanation skills, for example, right? So now I'm going to look at the whole lesson, and I'm going to see if I actually succeeded in doing that. Did I actually learn how to explain better? Am I better at explaining what I learned than I was before this lesson? So I'm going to look at my goal, and I'm going to see how well I achieved it. Now, how well did my learning strategy work? So as I was reading, I was using some tricks to help me remember things. How well did that work? So was it effective? Was it not effective? And now this is another important point. What didn't work? So this is for a strategy that I tried and that it didn't really have a good effect. And so if it didn't work, I don't need to use this again because it's not effective for me. Then the next question, what do I need to do differently when taking on a similar task in the future? So if for some reason I don't really remember what I read about Singapore, it was difficult and maybe the vocabulary was too hard, in the future, I should probably look up the vocabulary that is difficult in the passage before I read it so that it makes understanding a lot easier. Right? So this is something that I need to do kind of self-assessment, right? In terms of what should change in the future to make my learning more effective. And finally, how has my thinking on the topic changed? So I read this passage. Do I still have the same opinion that I had at the beginning, or has my opinion changed? And how does what I learned relate to other things I've been learning or have experienced? So again, how does the red puzzle piece of this lesson relate to the white puzzle pieces of all of my previous experience and understanding? And another thing is how I can expand my knowledge on the topic. So if I'm interested in Singapore, I can go ahead and read other things about it. I can watch videos, so I can expand my knowledge on the topic. Now, a good teacher will include this kind of activity as part of their lesson. So we're not going to just read the passage and end it there, but we're going to keep our students engaged by pushing them to learn more or to reflect more on what they learned on this topic. So how can I expand my knowledge? In our book series here, we've got a section at the end, which is called Over to You. And in the classroom, the Over to You section is just questions that you ask your students for kind of, further thinking, right? So in this case, our questions are, which technological innovation from Singapore do you want for your city or country, and why? And the other question is, what is the most significant technological advance of the last few decades and why? So in a classroom, you would ask this, maybe you would let them break out into groups, and then they could discuss it, and you would have, a big class meeting to talk about these ideas. But one thing you can do with online learning, especially, is to assign these questions as short essays for your students to write. So I'm going to use the first question here, and then we're going to assign that to our students, and we're going to talk about effective ways to answer this question and what a good answer looks like. So first of all, which technological innovation from Singapore do you want for your country or city, and why? to answer this question, I have to ask myself prior questions first. And the questions that I ask are going to determine how good my answer is. So some research questions to give a really good answer to number one. First of all, what problem was the innovation meant to solve? So let's say I've chosen Singapore's housing innovation. The first thing I'm going to answer is what problem it was meant to solve. This problem. 1 second. Yes. Okay. So Singapore had this problem and with their housing policy, and so this innovation was meant to solve that particular problem. Then the next question, how does it work? So I'm going to explain this innovation and I'm going to show how it works. Okay, what does the current system in my country or my city look like? So now I'm going to move to thinking about this innovation in the context of my city and my country. But you see that before I talk about this, before I even mention anything about my city, I have to talk about Singapore's innovation, why they started it, and how it works. And then I can go ahead and move on to talking about my country and the context for implementing it where I live. So the next question, what are some problems with the current system? And finally, how would this innovation address those issues specifically? So you see that before we can answer this question properly, we need to ask ourselves a series of research questions that will organize the writing that we're going to do. And this is a skill that your students have to learn over time, right? Asking good questions that will lead to good answers and good effective organization of writing. So if you're going to assign something like this to students, then you would have to go through this as part of your lesson, right? How to ask good questions, and then you would, tell them, okay, so what kind of questions would you want to ask if you would write a paragraph or 2 paragraphs about innovation in Singapore? So one thing I want you to think about here, number 2, the question is, what is the most significant technological advance of the last few decades and why? So what I want you to do is I want you to, first of all, choose a technological advance that you think is the most significant. And then I want you to think about some research questions that you need to answer if you were writing an essay on this topic. So before you even start searching for information, you have to come up with a list of questions that you will answer in your essay. All right, so I want you to think about that for a minute, and I want you to write them in the chat box, okay? What are some questions you will need to answer as part of your essay for this number 2 question? All right, so I'll give you guys 30 seconds just to write some questions, and we'll look at the chat box. All right, so I see some choices here. So someone is talking about video calls, smartphones. That's very good. So now what kinds of questions do you have to ask to organize your writing? So for example, in my case, I would ask something like, okay, when was this technology developed? What was the original purpose of the technology? Who created the technology, and when did it become popular, and what is it used for today, for example? So these are some questions that I'm going to use to organize my response in an essay form. Oh, this is very good here. What's the use we give to them? What is the expected future of smartphones? This is very good. So this is something we can use in the conclusion of our essay. So we talked about the history, and we'll say, well, in the future, we can expect smartphones to do X, Y, and Z. And this is a good one here. Origins, use, evolution. Yeah, these are all very, very good points. So again, in your classroom, you're going to actually teach your students as part of the lesson, you're going to teach them to think about these kinds of questions, and you're probably going to incorporate this kind of question writing or this question kind of brainstorming session into your classrooms, right, to get your students independent. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Now we're going to do a recap. So let's see how much you guys remember, and let's see how much you've retained. So when it comes to teaching self-regulated learning strategies, we've got the planning stage. In the planning stage, you must be concrete when it comes to answering your questions and asking your questions. What do I want to know about or do with this material? Okay, be as concrete as possible so that later you can evaluate yourself in an easier way. So I want to do this. Was I successful? Yes, no, simple. You can also break it down into steps. Okay, so I want to accomplish X. I can accomplish this by first doing this, and then doing this, and then doing this. Okay, so I've got a series of steps that I'm going to follow. And then at the end, I'm going to see how effective it was. Was it effective? Was it not effective? But I've got the steps that I can actually refer to when I'm done with my lesson. Okay, and you can apply this at each of the 3 stages. So you can do this at the monitoring stage. Go ahead and break down your goals and say, okay, now at this stage, I want to do X, Y, Z, and this is how I will accomplish them. And then let's see how it works. All right, so monitoring stage. We can do this as an individual, or we can do this in pairs. We can monitor each other. We can talk to our classmates. You can do group work, group exercises. You can make this a game or a competition where we, at the end, give students self-evaluation, and then we see who's most satisfied with their learning and who feels that they still have some ways to go. And then when it comes to evaluating, we can write brief reflections in class or at home on the nature of the subject matter. So this is, again, like essay writing to kind of expand our learning on the topic. And yeah, of course, we can modify this to include additional information and research. And finally, most importantly, coming up with questions you want to answer. I cannot emphasize this enough. This is a skill that you really, really need to teach your students, and that it's good even for yourself as a teacher, asking the right questions in order to get the best answers and to make the learning process more effective and efficient. And finally, you can also incorporate this into your lessons at the end. You can have your students write a brief self-assessment of their learning strategies. So not only are we talking about Singapore in this case, but we're talking about our learning strategies and how well we learned about it. So I'm going to write a short paragraph about my learning strategies. When I learned about Singapore, I tried to do X, Y, Z to remember the information better and to understand the vocabulary or the grammar better. And so I did X, Y, Z, and X was very effective for me because it helped me remember. Y was not so effective. So in the future, I should try to make an adjustment. And so if you're constantly thinking about how you're learning, it's going to help you. And finally, is this method of stage-based questioning working for me? And what adjustments should I make? So always thinking about adjustments to make in terms of learning strategies. Now here, making it explicit, this is very important. The higher level the student, or even in the earlier stages, you can also incorporate this. You want to make this whole process of self-regulated learning explicit to your students. You want to maybe take some time in your class and introduce the idea. Tell them, okay guys, I'm going to teach you, today we're going to talk about self-regulated learning. I'm going to teach you some strategies that you can use when you're learning any topic, any subject, to make your learning better, to make you a better learner, to help you remember the material more effectively. All right, so, and then you can actually have a lesson, you can devote one entire lesson if you'd like to just teaching the concepts or the ideas behind self-regulated learning. And then in your classes, you can incorporate these questions or have the students ask themselves questions during the 3 stages of the class, right? The planning, monitoring, and evaluating stage. All right, so finally we've got this lesson here. And what I want you to do for the next maybe minute and a half is I want you to look at this lesson. Okay, this is going to be a writing lesson, and the students are going to write a product review. So they're going to choose one of these 4, or maybe they want to compare all 4 together and write their product review in that way. But anyway, it's going to be a writing exercise. What I want you to do is I want you to think of ways that you can incorporate self-regulated learning into this exercise as a teacher. So go ahead, you've got a minute. Just think about some ideas that you can use in your classroom, some of these self-regulated learning ideas, to help your students get the most out of this particular lesson here. All right, so 1 minute, go. Okay, so that was a minute. Now, as you're thinking about these ideas and what you would like to do in your classroom, I'll just give you an example, which is my own example. So if you look at this page, you see that there are 4 different types of headphones here. And we've got, oh, 1 second. Yeah, okay, so we've got our 4 headphones, and we've got this section here on the side under B, which has all of their names, and it gives us pros and cons. So the idea here is that the students are going to read, and then they're going to write down the pros and cons based on what they read. Now, we can do that, but before we do that, another cool thing we can do is we can actually have our students try and guess what the pros and cons might be in order to prepare themselves and maybe compare and contrast what the actual pros and cons were after they've read. So here I've chosen 2. And the idea is I'll give my students a choice here between these 2, and I'm going to give them pros and cons for each. So we've got A and B, and I don't want to give them any information. What I'm going to say is, okay, based on how these earphones look, I want you to guess what the pros and cons are going to be. Okay, now, of course, when you're thinking about pros and cons of any item, you need to come up with categories from which you can judge and compare them, right? So what categories are we going to use to compare the pros and cons of these 2 items? So I've come up with a list here, and you can let your students actually brainstorm the categories that they want to compare the items with. You don't have to give this to them automatically or immediately, but you can, if you want to make things easier for them, if their level is a little bit lower and they don't really have the vocabulary to come up with these categories. But here, I've come up with 5. So we've got audio quality, connectivity, right? How good are these headphones, when it comes to maintaining the connection? Battery life, design, do they look cool? Do they look ugly? And fit, okay, are they comfortable? Are they uncomfortable? And now based on these 5 categories, I'm going to write my pros and cons, and this is all just based on how they look. It's not related to any actual features because we haven't started that part of the lesson yet. This is getting our students to kind of project what they might learn. And once they've done that and they're engaged in the lesson, then we can actually start the learning process. So that was my planning stage lesson. And from there, we would then go ahead and and do the actual lesson. Okay, so wrapping up. The big question, what do we have to teach besides English? So there's a mistake here. What do we have to teach besides English and why? Okay, so everybody write it in the chat box really quickly. What do we have to teach besides English? Life skills. Life skills, sort of, yes. Definitely what we're teaching is kind of a life skill. Aha, studying techniques. That's correct. Very good. So we're teaching English, but we're also teaching studying techniques so that the students can learn by themselves. Now, the question is why? We want them to become independent. We want to encourage learner autonomy. And the reason is that these skills will be crucial in the future, okay? Learning Compass 2030. Now, what are the 3 stages of self-regulated learning, and what questions do we ask at each stage? First stage is planning, and here we're going to ask ourselves questions like, what do I expect to learn from this lesson? How can I, or what is my goal, my learning goal for this lesson? And what do I already know about this topic, etc. Then the next stage is monitoring. So how well am I understanding the information? What techniques are working? What techniques are not working? Am I able to summarize? Am I able to remember everything? And then finally, evaluating, how well did my studying techniques work? Okay, so is there anything I need to change next time? Is there a way that I can learn better? So these are things that we want to think about. What were some activities we did at each stage? So a couple of things we did a mind map for Singapore based on what we already know. So we give students a chance to tell us what they know about the topic. And we also just did the compare and contrast using pros and cons with the 2 earphones. Now, what will we accomplish if we drill these strategies and make them explicit? So if we take time to explain these ideas to our students and to actually make them use the strategies in the classroom, what will we accomplish? Autonomy, hopefully, which is the goal of the OECD learning framework. And this is something that our students will be able to take out of the English classroom and transfer to other areas of their lives. Okay, so in a way, these are life skills, but they're learning strategies that have applications outside of the English classroom. All right, now, so we've, the seminar series that we have that you've just taken part in, has other, there are other presentations that will take place as well. So if you go into our website, you can get more information, but for now, you can see some of this information here. So the one that you've just taken part in right now is incorporating self-regulated learning in online lessons with SURPASS. And there are 2 more presentations that you can join. The next one will be on April 27th, and it's with Ji Young, and she's going to be talking about how to teach phonics using Come On Phonics. And then I'll be doing another presentation on planning online lessons for content-based learning with InsightLink. Okay, so if you're interested in attending any of these webinars, please register and go to our website for more information. And now, finally, we've got our opening slide, and you see this picture here. So based on what we've talked about today, I want you guys to think about this picture and try to think about what this could mean in the context of our presentation. So when you look at this woman sitting at her desk and you see the scissors and the strings, what do you think that means? I'll give you 5 seconds and write me an answer. Let's see what you guys think. What does that picture mean to you based on the lesson? Autonomy, self-regulated learning, promoting learners' autonomy. Very good. Okay, excellent. So guys, thank you very much for joining us today. I hope you had a great time. And now we're going to address any questions that you had. So if you have some time, please stick around and I'm going to answer some of the questions that we got in the chat box during the presentation. All right, so let me get out of here and let me address these questions. All right, so the first question is from Maria del Carmen Zuleta Neira. And the question is, mind mapping. Do you think it will be fine to ask them to write a mind map? I think that is absolutely fine. I would love for my students to write mind maps. And I think that this is a really useful tool that we can use in the classroom. I don't see any reason not to use it. So if you want to use mind maps, please go ahead and use them. Another question is, or a suggestion, we could give them rubrics previously, couldn't we? So yes, this is a really good idea. If you want to make this explicit, one good way of doing it is to come up with rubrics beforehand and then go through them as a class and get them in the habit of doing this over and over again. So you go through the rubric, and I guess this is more for the evaluation portion of the lesson, and they can maybe do this for homework, right? Go through the rubric and see, okay, how well did I learn? How well did these techniques work for me? And then write a kind of a short summary or a little reflection paper or paragraph on those particular learning strategies and how they worked. Okay, let's see. What is the theoretical background for the OECD Learning Compass 2030? Okay, so the OECD Learning Compass, the idea was the OECD, they got together with educators from, I think, over 50 countries, and they asked them, okay, in 2030, the world is going to be very different. What are some skills that our students are going to need to navigate in that kind of world? And so those educators, with all of their various backgrounds, they got together and they came up with this learning compass. And the theoretical background for the learning compass is basically this self-regulated learning framework. It's not exactly the same because it's going to be tailored toward slightly different goals, but ultimately it is self-regulated learning. So the self-regulated learning strategies that we've talked about today will be your primary tool when you are trying to address the goals of the OECD learning framework. And someone here says, I ask this because it reminds me of meaningful learning. And yeah, this is a very good point, right? So meaningful learning, self-regulated learning, they're absolutely related because, of course, meaningful learning is learning that involves something or involves techniques that make it more personal, right? Personalized. And self-regulated learning is not only personalizing the lesson, but taking control of your own learning strategies and how you approach learning about subjects. So it is absolutely related to meaningful learning. And yeah, that's a very good point. All right, everybody. So once again, thank you very much for joining us. And that is the end of our presentation. Thank you.